Titus Andronicus is a tragedy by William Shakespeare, believed to have been written between 1588 and 1593, probably in collaboration with George Peele. It is thought to be Shakespeare's first tragedy, and is often seen as his attempt to emulate the violent and bloody revenge plays of his contemporaries, which were extremely popular with audiences throughout the 16th century. The play is set during the latter days of the Roman Empire and tells the fictional story of Titus, a general in the Roman army, who is engaged in a cycle of revenge with Tamora, Queen of the Goths. It is Shakespeare's bloodiest and most violent work, and traditionally was one of his least respected plays. Although it was extremely popular in its day, by the later 17th century it had fallen out of favor. In the Victorian era, it was disapproved of, primarily because of what was considered to be a distasteful use of graphic violence. But from around the middle of the 20th century its reputation began to improve. Characters. Synopsis. Gravelot illustration of Aaron cutting off Titus's hand in Act 3. Scene 1. Engraved by Gerard van der Gucht. The play begins shortly after the death of the Roman emperor, with his two sons, Saturninus and Bassianus, squabbling over who will succeed him. Their conflict seems set to boil over into violence until a tribune, Marcus Andronicus, announces that the people's choice for the new emperor is Marcus's brother, Titus, who will shortly return to Rome from a victorious 10-year campaign against the Goths. Titus subsequently arrives to much fanfare, bearing with him as prisoners the Queen of the Goths, Tamora, her three sons, Alarbus, Chiron, and Demetrius, and Aaron the Moor, her secret lover. Despite Tamora's desperate pleas, Titus sacrifices her eldest son, Alarbus, to avenge the deaths of his own sons during the war. Distraught, Tamora and her two surviving sons vow to obtain revenge on Titus and his family. Meanwhile, Titus refuses the offer of the throne, arguing that he is not fit to rule and instead supporting the claim of Saturninus, who then is duly elected. Saturninus tells Titus that for his first act as emperor, he will marry Titus's daughter Lavinia. Titus agrees, although Lavinia is already betrothed to Saturninus's brother, Bassianus, who refuses to give her up. Titus's sons tell Titus that Bassianus is in the right under Roman law, but Titus refuses to listen, accusing them all of treason. A scuffle breaks out, during which Titus kills his own son, Mucius. Saturninus then denounces the Andronici family for their effrontery and shocks Titus by marrying Tamora, putting into motion her plan for revenge. Tamora advises Saturninus to pardon Bassianus and the Andronici family, which he reluctantly does. During a royal hunt the following day, Aaron persuades Demetrius and Chiron to kill Bassianus, so they may rape Lavinia. They do so, throwing Bassianus's body into a pit and dragging Lavinia deep into the forest before violently raping her. To keep her from revealing what has happened, they cut out her tongue and cut off her hands. Meanwhile, Aaron writes a forged letter, which frames Titus's sons Martius and Quintus for the murder of Bassianus. Horrified at the death of his brother, Saturninus arrests Martius and Quintus, and sentences them to death. Some time later, Marcus discovers the mutilated Lavinia and takes her to her father, who is still shocked at the accusations leveled at his sons. And upon seeing Lavinia, he is overcome with grief. Aaron then visits Titus and falsely tells him that Saturninus will spare Martius and Quintus if either Titus, Marcus or Titus's remaining son, Lucius, cuts off one of their hands and sends it to him. Titus has Aaron cut off his, Titus' left hand and sends it to the emperor, but, in return, a messenger brings Titus Martius and Quintus's severed heads, along with Titus's own severed hand. Desperate for revenge, Titus orders Lucius to flee Rome and raise an army among their former enemy, the Goths. Later, Lavinia writes the names of her attackers in the dirt, using a stick held with her mouth and between her mutilated arms. Meanwhile, Tamora secretly gives birth to a mixed-race child, fathered by Aaron. Aaron kills the nurse to keep the child's race a secret and flees with the baby to save it from Saturn and his inevitable wrath. Thereafter, Lucius, marching on Rome with an army, captures Aaron and threatens to hang the infant. In order to save the baby, Aaron reveals the entire revenge plot to Lucius. Illustration of the death of Chiron and Demetrius from Act 5, Scene 2, from the works of Mr. William Shakespeare, edited by Nicholas Rowe. Back in Rome, Titus's behavior suggests he may have gone insane. Convinced of his madness, Tamora, Chiron, and Demetrius approach him, dressed as the spirits of revenge, murder, and rape. Tamora, as revenge, tells Titus that she will grant him revenge on all of his enemies if he can convince Lucius to postpone the imminent attack on Rome. Titus agrees and sends Marcus to invite Lucius to a reconciliatory feast. Revenge then offers to invite the emperor and Tamora as well, and is about to leave when Titus insists that rape and murder, Chiron and Demetrius, respectively, stay with him. When Tamora is gone, Titus cuts their throats and drains their blood into a basin held by Lavinia. Titus morbidly tells Lavinia that he plans to play the cook, grind the bones of Demetrius and Chiron into powder, and bake their heads. The next day, during the feast at his house, Titus asks Saturninus if a father should kill his daughter when she has been raped. When Saturninus answers that he should, Titus kills Lavinia and tells Saturninus of the rape. When the emperor calls for Chiron and Demetrius, Titus reveals that they have been baked in the pie Tamora has just been eating. Titus then kills Tamora and is immediately killed by Saturninus, who is subsequently killed by Lucius to avenge his father's death. Lucius is then proclaimed emperor. He orders that Saturninus be given a state burial, that Tamora's body be thrown to the wild beasts outside the city, and that Aaron be buried chest-deep and left to die of thirst and starvation. Aaron, however, is unrepentant to the end, regretting only that he had not done more evil in his life. Date and text. Date. The earliest known record of Titus Andronicus is found in Philip Henslow's diary on the 24th of January 1594, where Henslow recorded a performance by Sussex's men of Titus and Andronicus, probably at the Rose. Henslow marked the play as "nay," which most critics take to mean "new." There were subsequent performances on the 29th of January and the 6th of February. Also on the 6th of February, the printer John Danter entered into the Stationer's Register a book entitled A Noble Roman History of Titus Andronicus. Later, in 1594, Danter published the play in quarto under the title The Most Lamentable Roman Tragedy of Titus Andronicus, referred to by scholars as Q1, for the booksellers Edward White and Thomas Millington, making it the first of Shakespeare's plays to be printed. This evidence establishes that the latest possible date of composition is late 1593. There is evidence, however, that the play may have been written some years earlier than this. Perhaps the most famous such evidence relates to a comment made in 1614 by Ben Jonson in Bartholomew Fair. In the preface, Jonson wrote, "He that will swear Geronimo or Andronicus are the best plays, yet shall pass unaccepted at here, as a man whose judgment shows it is constant, and hath stood still these 25 or 30 years." The success and popularity of Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, to which Jonson alludes, is attested by many contemporary documents. So by placing Titus alongside it, Jonson is saying that Titus too must have been extremely popular in its day. But by 1614, both plays had come to be seen as old-fashioned, if Jonson is taken literally. For the play to have been between 25 and 30 years old in 1614, It must have been written between 1584 and 1589, a theory which not all scholars reject out of hand. For example, in his 1953 edition of the play for the Art and Shakespeare Second Series, J.C. Maxwell argues for a date of late 1589. However, the majority of scholars tend to favor a post-1590 date, and one of the primary arguments for this is that the title page of Q1 assigns the play to three different playing companies: Derby's Men, Pembroke's Men and Sussex's Men, as it was played by the Right Honourable the Earl of Derby, Earl of Pembroke, and Earl of Seoul, X their Sarowens. This is highly unusual in copies of Elizabethan plays, which usually refer to one company only, if any. As such, even amongst scholars who favor a post-1590 date, 1592 is by no means universally accepted. Jacques Berthoud, for example, argues that Shakespeare had close associations with Derby's Men, and it would seem that Titus Andronicus must already have entered the repertoire of Derby's Men by the end of 1591 or the start of 1592 at the latest. Quote, other critics have attempted to use more scientific methods to determine the date of the play. For example, Gary Taylor has employed stylometry, particularly the study of contractions, colloquialisms, rare words and function words. Taylor concludes that the entire play except Act 3, Scene 2 was written just after Henry VI, Part 2 and Henry VI, Part 3, which he assigns to late 1591 or early 1592. As such, Taylor settles on a date of mid-1592 for Titus. He also argues that 3:2, which is only found in the 1623 folio text, was written contemporaneously with Romeo and Juliet in late 1593. However, if the play was written and performed by 1588, Hughes, 1589, Maxwell, 1591, Berthoud, 1592, Waite and Taylor, or 1593, Bate, why did Henslow refer to it as Nay in 1594? R. A. Folks and R. T. Rickert, modern editors of Henslow's diary, argue that Nay could refer to a newly licensed play, which would make sense if one accepts Waite's argument that Pembroke's Men had sold the rights to Sussex's Men upon returning from their failed tour of the provinces. Folks and Rickert also point out that Nay could refer to a newly revised play, suggesting editing on Shakespeare's part sometime in late 1593. Text. The 1594 quarto text of the play, with the same title, was reprinted by James Roberts for Edward White in 1600. Q2. On the 19th of April 1602, Millington sold his share in the copyright to Thomas Pavier. However, the next version of the play was published again for White in 1611, under the slightly altered title The Most Lamentable Tragedy of Titus Andronicus, printed by Edward Auld. Q3. Q1 is considered a good text, i.e., not a bad quarto or a reported text, and it forms the basis for most modern editions of the play. Q2 appears to be based on a damaged copy of Q1, as it is missing a number of lines which are replaced by what appear to be guesswork on the part of the compositor. This is especially noticeable at the end of the play, where 4 lines of dialogue have been added to Lucius's closing speech. See Justice done on Aaron, that damned Moor, by whom our heavy haps had their beginning. Then afterwards to order well the state, that like events may ne'er it ruin it. Scholars tend to assume that when the compositor got to the last page and saw the damage, he presumed some lines were missing, when in fact none were. Q2 also corrects a number of minor errors in Q1. Q3 is a further degradation of Q2, and includes a number of corrections to the Q2 text, but introduces many more errors. The first folio text of 1623, f1, under the title The Lamentable Tragedy of Titus Andronicus, is based primarily on the Q3 text, which is why modern editors use Q1 as the control rather than the usual practice in Shakespeare of using the folio text. However, the folio text includes material found in none of the quarto editions, primarily Act 3, Scene 2, also called the fly-killing scene. It is believed that while Q3 was probably the main source for the folio, an annotated prompter's copy was also used, particularly in relation to stage directions, which differ significantly from all of the quarto texts. As such, the text of the play that is today known as Titus Andronicus involves a combination of material from Q1 and F1, the vast majority of which is taken from Q1. The Peachum drawing. An important piece of evidence relating to both the dating and text of Titus is the so-called Peachum drawing, or Longleat manuscript, the only surviving contemporary Shakespearean illustration, now residing in the library of the Marquess of Bath at Longleat. The drawing appears to depict a performance of Titus, under which is quoted some dialogue. Eugene M. Waite argues of the illustration that the gestures and costumes give us a more vivid impression of the visual impact of Elizabethan acting than we get from any other source. Quote, far from being an acknowledged source of evidence, however, the document has provoked varying interpretations, with its date in particular often called into question. The fact that the text reproduced in the drawing seems to borrow from Q1, Q2, Q3 and F1, whilst also inventing some of its own readings, further complicates matters. Additionally, a possible association with Shakespearean forger John Payne Collier has served to undermine its authenticity, whilst some scholars believe it depicts a play other than Titus Andronicus, and is therefore of limited use to Shakespeareans. Analysis and criticism. Critical history. Although Titus was extremely popular in its day, over the course of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries it became perhaps Shakespeare's most maligned play, and it was only in the latter half of the 20th century that this pattern of denigration showed any signs of subsiding. One of the earliest, and one of the most famous critical disparagements of the play occurred in 1678, in the introduction to Edward Ravenscroft's theatrical adaptation, Titus Andronicus, or The Rape of Lavinia, a tragedy, altered from Mr. Shakespeare's works. Speaking of the original play, Ravenscroft wrote, "'Tis the most incorrect and indigested piece in all his works. It seems rather a heap of rubbish than a structure." Quote, he goes on to say that if the play had been by anyone other than Shakespeare, it would have been lost and forgotten. It is only because tradition holds that Shakespeare wrote it, which Dover Wilson highly suspects, that it is remembered, not for any intrinsic qualities of its own. In his 1998 book, Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, Harold Bloom attacked the play on numerous occasions, calling it a howler, a poetic atrocity, an exploitative parody, with the inner purpose of destroying the ghost of Christopher Marlowe, and a blow-up, an explosion of rancid irony. Bloom summates his views by declaring, "I can concede no intrinsic value to Titus Andronicus," citing the 1955 Royal Shakespeare Company, RSC, production, directed by Peter Brook and starring Laurence Olivier, which is generally agreed to have provided the impetus for the 20th century revaluation of the play. Bloom said that the audience laughed several times in scenes which were supposed to be tragic, and he sees this as evidence for its failure as tragedy. He particularly focuses his criticism on the line when Lavinia is told to carry Titus severed hand in her mouth, arguing that no play which contains such a scene could possibly be serious. He thus concludes the best director to tackle the play would be Mel Brooks. However, although the play continued to have its detractors, it began to acquire its champions as well. In 2001, Jacques Berthed pointed out that until shortly after World War II, Titus Andronicus was taken seriously only by a handful of textual and bibliographic scholars. Readers, when they could be found, mostly regarded it as a contemptible farrago of violence and bombast, while theatrical managers treated it as either a script in need of radical rewriting, or as a showbiz opportunity for a star actor. By 2001, however, this was no longer the case, as many prominent scholars had come out in defense of the play. Titus Andronicus is by no means the most brutal of Shakespeare's plays. More people die in Richard III. King Lear is a much more cruel play. In the whole Shakespearean repertory I can find no scene so revolting as Cordelia's death. In reading, the cruelties of Titus can seem ridiculous, but I have seen it on the stage and found it a moving experience. Why? In watching Titus Andronicus we come to understand, perhaps more than by looking at any other Shakespeare play, the nature of his genius. He gave an inner awareness to passions. Cruelty ceased to be merely physical. Shakespeare discovered the moral hell. He discovered heaven as well, but he remained on earth. In his 1987 edition of the play for the contemporary Shakespeare series, A.L. Rose speculates as to why the fortunes of the play have begun to change during the 20th century. In the civilized Victorian age the play could not be performed because it could not be believed. Such is the horror of our own age, with the appalling barbarities of prison camps and resistance movements paralleling the torture and mutilation and feeding on human flesh of the play, that it has ceased to be improbable. Quote, Thomas Kirk illustration of Aaron protecting his son from Chiron and Demetrius in Act 4, Scene 2, engraved by J. Hogg. Director Julie Taymor, who staged a production off-Broadway in 1994 and directed a film version in 1999, says she was drawn to the play because she found it to be the most relevant of Shakespeare's plays for the modern era. Quote, authorship. Perhaps the most frequently discussed topic in the play's critical history is that of authorship. None of the three-quarto editions of Titus name the author, which was normal for Elizabethan plays. However, Francis Meres does list the play as one of Shakespeare's tragedies in Pilates Demia in 1598. Additionally, John Hemminges and Henry Condell felt sure enough of Shakespeare's authorship to include it in the first folio in 1623. As such, with what little available solid evidence suggesting that Shakespeare did indeed write the play, questions of authorship tend to focus on the perceived lack of quality in the writing, and often the play's resemblance to the work of contemporaneous dramatists. The first to question Shakespeare's authorship is thought to have been Edward Ravenscroft in 1678, and over the course of the 18th century, numerous renowned Shakespeareans followed suit. Nicholas Rowe, Alexander Pope, Louis Theobald, Samuel Johnson, George Stephens, Edmund Malone, William Guthrie, John Upton, Benjamin Heath, Richard Farmer, John Pinkerton, and John Monck Mason, and in the 19th century, William Hazlitt and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Similarly, in 1832, the Globe illustrated Shakespeare claimed there was universal agreement on the matter due to the un-Shakespearean barbarity of the play. However, despite the fact that so many Shakespearean scholars believed the play to have been written by someone other than Shakespeare, there were those throughout the 18th and 19th century who argued against this theory. One such scholar was Edward Coppale, who, in 1768, said that the play was badly written but asserted that Shakespeare did write it. Another major scholar to support Shakespeare's authorship was Charles Knight in 1843. Several years later, a number of prominent German Shakespeareans also voiced their belief that Shakespeare wrote the play, including A. W. Schlegel and Hermann Ulrichi. 20th century criticism moved away from trying to prove or disprove that Shakespeare wrote the play, and has instead come to focus on the issue of co-authorship. Ravenscroft had hinted at this in 1678, but the first modern scholar to look at the theory was John Mackinnon Robertson in 1905, who concluded that much of the play is written by George Peele, and it is hardly less certain that much of the rest was written by Robert Greene or Kidd, with some by Marlowe. Quote, illustration of Aaron protecting his son from Chiron and Demetrius in Act 4. Scene 2. From Joseph Graves's dramatic tales founded on Shakespeare's plays. The first major critic to challenge Robertson, Parrott and Timberlake, was E. K. Chambers, who successfully exposed inherent flaws in Robertson's methodology. Beginning in 1948, with John Dover Wilson, many scholars have tended to favor the theory that Shakespeare and Peele collaborated in some way. Dover Wilson, for his part, believed that Shakespeare edited a play originally written by Peele. However, there have always been scholars who believe that Shakespeare worked on the play alone. Many of the editors of the various 20th century scholarly editions of the play, for example, have argued against the co-authorship theory. Eugene M. Waite in his Oxford Shakespeare edition of 1985, Alan Hughes in his Cambridge Shakespeare edition of 1994 and again in 2006, and Jonathan Bate in his Arden Shakespeare edition of 1995. In the case of Bate, however, in 2002, he came out in support of Brian Vickers' book Shakespeare, co-author, which restates the case for Peele as the author of Act 1, 2, 1 and 4. 1. Vickers' analysis of the issue is the most extensive yet undertaken, as well as analyzing the distribution of a large number of rhetorical devices throughout the play. He also devised 3 new authorship tests: an analysis of polysyllabic words, an analysis of the distribution of alliteration, and an analysis of vocatives. His findings led him to assert, with complete confidence, that Peele wrote Act 1, 2, 1 and 4. 1. Vickers' findings have yet to be challenged. Language. Jean-Michel Moreau illustration of Lucius telling his father the tribunes have left. From Act 3, Scene 1. Engraved by N. Lemire. The language of Titus has always had a central role in criticism of the play, insofar as those who doubt Shakespeare's authorship have often pointed to the apparent deficiencies in the language as evidence of that claim. However, the quality of the language has had its defenders over the years. Critics who argue that the play is more linguistically complex than is often thought, and features a more accomplished use of certain linguistic motifs than has hitherto been allowed for. One of the most basic such motifs is repetition. Several words and topics occur time and again, serving to connect and contrast characters and scenes, and to foreground certain themes. Perhaps the most obvious recurring motifs are those of honor, virtue and nobility, all of which are mentioned multiple times throughout the play, especially during the first act. The play's opening line is Saturn in his address to noble patricians, patrons of my right. L1. In the second speech of the play, Bassianus states, and suffer not dishonor to approach the imperial seat, to virtue consecrate, to justice, continence and nobility, but let desert and pure election shine. L13, 16. From this point onwards, the concept of nobility is at the heart of everything that happens. H.B. Charlton argues of this opening act that the standard of moral currency most in use is honor. Quote, when Marcus announces Titus' imminent arrival, he emphasizes Titus' renowned honor and integrity. And now at last, laden with honor's spoils, returns the good Andronicus to Rome. Renowned Titus, flourishing in arms, let us entreat by honor of his name, whom worthily you would have now succeed. L. 36, 40. Marcus' reference to Titus' name is even itself an allusion to his nobility insofar as Titus' full Title: Titus Pius, is an honorary epitaph which refers to his devotion to patriotic duty. Quote, Bassianus then cites his own admiration for all of the Andronici. Marcus Andronicus. So I do happy in thy uprightness and integrity, and so I love and honor thee and thy noble brother Titus, and his sons. L. 47:50. Upon Titus' arrival, an announcement is made, patron of virtue, Rome's best champion, successful in the battles that he fights, with honor and with fortune is returned. L. 65:68. Once Titus has arrived on stage, it is not long before he too is speaking of honor, virtue and integrity, referring to the family tomb as a sweet cell of virtue and nobility. L. 93. After Titus chooses Saturninus as emperor, they praise one another's honor, with Saturninus referring to Titus' honorable family. L. 239. And Titus claiming, I hold me highly honored of your grace. L. 245. Titus then says to Timora, Now, madam, are you prisoner to an emperor? To him that for your honor and your state will use you nobly and your followers. L. 258. 260. Even when things begin to go awry for the Andronici, each one maintains a firm grasp of his own interpretation of honor. The death of Lucius comes about because Titus and his sons have different concepts of honor. Titus feels the emperor's desires should have precedence. His sons that Roman law should govern all, including the emperor. As such, when Lucius reprimands Titus for slaying one of his own sons, Titus responds, Nor thou, nor he, are any sons of mine. My sons would never so dishonor me. L. 296. Moments later, Saturninus declares to Titus, I'll trust by leisure him that mocks me once. Thee never, nor thy traitorous haughty sons, confederates all to dishonor me. L. 301. 303. Subsequently, Titus cannot quite believe that Saturninus has chosen Timora as his empress and again sees himself dishonored. Titus, when wert thou wont to walk alone, dishonored thus and challenged of wrongs? L. 340. 341. When Marcus is pleading with Titus that Lucius should be allowed to be buried in the family tomb, he implores, Suffer thy brother Marcus to enter, his noble nephew here in virtue's nest, that died in honor and Lavinia's cause. Quote, L. 375. 377. Having reluctantly agreed to allow Lucius a royal burial, Titus then returns to the issue of how he feels his sons have turned on him and dishonored him. The dismal day is this that ere I saw, to be dishonored by my sons in Rome. L. 384. 385. At this point, Marcus, Martius, Quintus and Lucius declare of the slain Lucius, he lives in fame, that died in virtue's cause. L. 390. Other characters also become involved in the affray resulting from the disagreement among the Andronici, and they too are equally concerned with honor. After Saturninus has condemned Titus, Bassianus appeals to him. This noble gentleman, Lord Titus here, is in opinion and in honor wronged. L. 415. 416. Then, in a surprising move, Timora suggests to Saturninus that he should forgive Titus and his family. Saturninus is at first aghast, believing that Timora is now dishonoring him as well. What madam, be dishonored openly, and basely put it up without revenge. Quote, L. 442. 443. To which Timora replies, The irony here of course, is that her false appeal to honor is what begins the bloody cycle of revenge which dominates the rest of the play. Thomas Kirk illustration of young Lucius fleeing from Lavinia in Act 4. Scene 1. Engraved by B. Reading. Although not all subsequent scenes are as heavily saturated with references to honor, nobility and virtue as is the opening, they are continually alluded to throughout the play. Other notable examples include Erin's description of Timora. Upon her wit doth earthly honor wait, and virtue stoops and trembles at her frown. An ironic and sarcastic reference to honor occurs when Bassianus and Lavinia encounter Erin and Timora in the forest, and Bassianus tells Timora, "Your swarthy Cimmerian doth make your honor of his body's hue, spotted, detested, and abominable." Later, after the clown has delivered Titus' letter to Saturninus, Saturninus declares, "Go, drag the villain hither by the hair. Nor age nor honor shall shape privilege." Another example is seen outside Rome, when a Goth refers to Lucius, whose high exploits and honorable deeds, ingrateful Rome requites with foul contempt. A further significant motif is metaphor related to violence. The world of Titus is not simply one of meaningless acts of random violence, but rather one in which language engenders violence, and violence is done to language through the distance between word and thing, between metaphor and what it represents. For example, in 3:1, when Titus asks Erin to cut off his hand because he believes it will save his sons' lives, he says, "Lend me thy hand, and I will give thee mine." Therefore, in the language of Titus, to lend one's hand is to risk dismemberment. Quote, "No discussion of the language of Titus is complete without reference to Marcus's speech upon finding Lavinia after her rape. In this much-discussed speech, the discrepancy between the beautiful imagery and the horrific sight before us has been noted by many critics as jarring, and the speech is often severely edited or completely removed for performance. In the 1955 RSC production, for example, director Peter Brook cut the speech entirely. There is also a great deal of disagreement amongst critics as to the essential meaning of the speech. John Dover Wilson, for example, sees it as nothing more than a parody. Shakespeare mocking the work of his contemporaries by writing something so bad. He finds no other tonally analogous speech in all of Shakespeare, concluding it is a bundle of ill-matched conceits held together by sticky sentimentalism. Quote, however, defenders of the play have posited several theories which seek to illustrate the thematic relevance of the speech. For example, Nicholas Brooke argues that it stands in the place of a Cora commentary on the crime, establishing its significance to the play by making an emblem of the mutilated woman. Quote, another theory is suggested by Anthony Bryan Taylor, who argues simply that Marcus is babbling, beginning with references to dream and slumber, and ending with one to sleep. The speech is an old man's reverie, shaken by the horrible and totally unexpected spectacle before him. He has succumbed to the senile tendency to drift away and become absorbed in his own thoughts, rather than confront the harshness of reality. D.J. Palmer feels that the speech is an attempt to rationalize in Marcus' own mind the sheer horror of what he is seeing. Marcus' lament is an effort to realize a sight that taxes to the utmost the powers of understanding and utterance. The vivid conceits in which he pictures his hapless niece do not transform or depersonalize her. She is already transformed and depersonalized. In contradistinction to Dover, Wilson, and Waite, several scholars have argued that whilst the speech may not work on the page, it can work in performance. Discussing the Deborah Warner RSC production at the Swan in 1987, which used an unedited text, Stanley Wells argues that Donald Sumter's delivery of the speech became a deeply moving attempt to master the facts and thus to overcome the emotional shock of a previously unimagined horror. We had the sense of a suspension of time, as if the speech represented an articulation, necessarily extended in expression, of a sequence of thoughts and emotions that might have taken no more than a second or two to flash through the character's mind, like a bad dream. Quote, Samuel Woodford illustration of Timora watching Lavinia dragged away to be raped. From Act 2, Scene 3, engraved by Anchor Smith. Looking at the language of the play in a more general sense has also produced a range of critical theories. For example, Jacques Berthet argues that the rhetoric of the play is explicitly bound up with its theme. The entire dramatic script, soliloquies included, functions as a network of responses and reactions. Themes. Performance. The earliest definite recorded performance of Titus was on the 24th of January 1594, when Philip Henslowe noted a performance by Sussex's men of Titus and Andronicus. Although Henslowe doesn't specify a theatre, it was most likely the Rose. Repeated performances were staged on the 28th of January and the 6th of February. On 5 and the 12th of June, Henslowe recorded 2 further performances of the play, at the Newington Butts Theatre by the combined Admiral's men and Lord Chamberlain's men. Some scholars, however, have suggested that the January 1594 performance may not be the first recorded performance of the play. On the 11th of April 1592, Henslowe recorded 10 performances by Derby's men of a play called Titus and Vespasian, which some, such as E.K. Chambers, have identified with Shakespeare's play. Philip James de Loutherbourg illustration of Quintus trying to help Martius from the hole in Act 2, Scene 3, engraved by Hall. Although it is known that the play was definitely popular in its day, there is no other recorded performance for many years. In January 1668, it was listed by the Lord Chamberlain as one of 21 plays owned by the King's Company which had, at some stage previously, been acted at Blackfriars Theatre, a catalogue of part of his maid's servants' plays as they were formerly acted at the Blackfriars and now allowed of to his maid's servants at Ye New Theatre. However, no other information is provided. During the late 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, adaptations of the play came to dominate the stage, and after the Burley performance in 1596 and the possible Blackfriars performance sometime prior to 1667, there is no definite recorded performance of the Shakespearean text in England until the early 20th century. After over 300 years absent from the English stage, the play returned on the 8th of October 1923, in a production directed by Robert Atkins at the Old Vic, as part of the Vic's presentation of the complete dramatic works over a 7-year period. The production featured Wilfred Walter as Titus, Florence Saunders as Tamora, George Hayes as Aaron and Jane Bacon as Lavinia. Reviews at the time praised Hayes' performance but criticized Walters as monotonous. The earliest known performance of the Shakespearean text in the United States was in April 1924, when the Alpha Delta Phi fraternity of Yale University staged the play under the direction of John M. Burton and E. M. Woolley as part of a double bill with Robert Greene's Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay. The best-known and most successful production of the play in England was directed by Peter Brook for the RSC at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in 1955, starring Laurence Olivier as Titus, Maxine Audley as Tamora, Anthony Quayle as Aaron and Vivian Lew as Lavinia. Brooke had been offered the chance to direct Macbeth but had controversially turned it down, and instead decided to stage Titus. The success of the Brooke production seems to have provided an impetus for directors to tackle the play, and ever since 1955, there has been a steady stream of performances on the English and American stages. After Brooke, the next major production came in 1967, when Douglas Seale directed an extremely graphic and realistic presentation at the Center Stage in Baltimore with costumes that recalled the various combatants in World War II. Seale's production employed a strong sense of theatrical realism to make parallels between the contemporary period and that of Titus, and thus comment on the universality of violence and revenge. Seale set the play in the 1940s and made pointed parallels with concentration camps, the massacre at Katyn, the Nuremberg rallies and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. Saturninus was based on Benito Mussolini and all his followers dressed entirely in black. Titus was modeled after a Prussian army officer. The Andronici wore Nazi insignia, and the Goths at the end of the play were dressed in Allied forces uniforms. The murders in the last scene are all carried out by gunfire, and at the end of the play swastikas rained down onto the stage. The play received mixed reviews, with many critics wondering why Seoul had chosen to associate the Andronici with Nazism, arguing that it created a mixed metaphor. Later in 1967, as a direct reaction to Seoul's realistic production, Gerald Friedman directed a performance for Joseph Papp's Shakespeare Festival at the Delacorte Theatre in Central Park, Manhattan, starring Jack Hollander as Titus, Olympia Dukakis as Tamora, Moses Gunn as Aaron, and Aaron Martin as Lavinia. Friedman had seen Seoul's production and felt it failed because it worked by bringing into play our sense of reality in terms of detail and literal time structure. Quote, he argued that when presented realistically, the play simply doesn't work, as it raises too many practical questions, such as why does Lavinia not bleed to death? Why does Marcus not take her to the hospital immediately? Why does Tamora not notice that the pie tastes unusual? Exactly how do both Martius and Quintus manage to fall into a hole? Friedman argued that, if one wants to create a fresh emotional response to the violence, blood and multiple mutilations of Titus Andronicus, one must shock the imagination and subconscious with visual images that recall the richness and depth of primitive rituals. Quote, in 1972, Trevor Nunn directed an RSC production at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, as part of a presentation of the 4 Roman plays, starring Colin Blakely as Titus, Margaret Isaac as Tamora, Calvin Lockhart as Aaron, and Janet Suzman as Lavinia. Colin Blakely and John Wood as a vicious and maniacal Saturn, and has received particularly positive reviews. This production took the realistic approach and did not shirk from the more specific aspects of the violence. For example, Lavinia has trouble walking after the rape, which, it is implied, was anal rape. Nunn believed the play asked profound questions about the sustainability of Elizabethan society, and as such, he linked the play to the contemporary period to ask the same questions of late 20th century England. He was less concerned with the condition of ancient Rome than with the morality of contemporary life. Quote, the play was performed for the first time at the Stratford Shakespeare Festival in Ontario, Canada in 1978, when it was directed by Brian Bedford, starring William Hutt as Titus, Jennifer Phipps as Tamora, Alan Scarfe as Aaron, and Dominique Blythe as Lavinia. Bedford went with neither stylization nor realism. Instead, the violence simply tended to happen off stage, but everything else was realistically presented. The play received mixed reviews, with some praising its restraint and others arguing that the suppression of the violence went too far. Many cited the final scene, where despite 3 on-stage stabbings, not one drop of blood was visible, and the reveal of Lavinia, where she was totally bloodless despite her mutilation. This production cut Lucius's final speech and instead ended with Aaron alone on the stage as Sybil predicts the fall of Rome in lines written by Bedford himself. A celebrated and unedited production. According to Jonathan Bate, not a single line from Q1 was cut. Was directed by Deborah Warner in 1987 at the Swan and remounted at Barbican's Pit in 1988 for the RSC, starring Brian Cox as Titus, Estelle Kohler as Tamora, Peter Polycarpou as Aaron, and Sonia Ritter as Lavinia. Met with almost universally positive reviews. Jonathan Bate regards it as the finest production of any Shakespearean play of the entire 1980s. In 1988, Mark Rucker directed a realistic production at Shakespeare Santa Cruz, starring J. Kenneth Campbell as Titus, Molly Maycock as Tamora, Elizabeth Atkinson as Lavinia, and an especially well-received performance by Bruce A. Young as Aaron. Campbell presented Titus in a much more sympathetic light than usual. For example, he kills Lucius by accident, pushing him so that he falls against a tree, and his refusal to allow Lucius to be buried was performed as if in a dream state. Prior to the production, Rucker had Young work out and get in shape so that by the time of the performance, he weighed 240 pounds, standing at 6'4". His Aaron was purposely designed to be the most physically imposing character on the stage. Additionally, he was often positioned as standing on hills and tables, with the rest of the cast below him. When he appears with the Goths, he is not their prisoner, but willingly enters their camp in pursuit of his baby, the implication being that without this one weakness, he would have been invincible. In 1994, Julie Taymor directed the play at the Theatre for the New City. The production featured a prologue and epilogue set in the modern era, foregrounded the character of young Lucius, who acts as a kind of correct observer of events, and starred Robert Stadel as Titus, Melinda Mullins as Tamora, Harry Lennox as Aaron and Miriam Healy-Louis as Lavinia. Heavily inspired in her design by Joel Peter Witkin, Taymor used stone columns to represent the people of Rome, who she saw as silent and incapable of expressing any individuality or subjectivity. Controversially, the play ended with the implication that Lucius had killed Aaron's baby, despite his vow not to. In 1995, Gregory Dorn directed a production at the Royal National Theatre, which also played at the Market Theatre in Johannesburg, South Africa, starring Anthony Sher as Titus, Dorothy Ann Gould as Tamora, Sello Mock as Aaron and Jennifer Woodbine as Lavinia. Although Dorn explicitly denied any political overtones, the play was set in a modern African context and made explicit parallels to South African politics. In his production notes, which Dorn co-wrote with Sher, he stated, "Surely, to be relevant, theater must have an umbilical connection to the lives of the people watching it." One particularly controversial decision was to have the play spoken in indigenous accents rather than received pronunciation, which allegedly resulted in many white South Africans refusing to see the play. Writing in Plays International in August 1995, Robert Lloyd Perry argued the questions raised by Titus went far beyond the play itself. For the first time since 1987, the RSC staged the play in 2003, under the direction of Bill Alexander and starring David Bradley as Titus, Maureen Beattie as Tamora, Joe Dixon as Aaron and Eve Miles as Lavinia. Convinced that Act 1 was by George Peele, Alexander felt he was not undermining the integrity of Shakespeare by drastically altering it. For example, Saturninus and Tamora are present throughout. They never leave the stage. There is no division between the upper and lower levels. All mention of Lucius is absent, and over 100 lines were removed. Laura Rees as Lavinia in Lucy Bailey's 2006 production at Shakespeare's Globe. Note the realistic effects and blood. In 2006, two major productions were staged within a few weeks of one another. The first opened on the 29th of May at Shakespeare's Globe, directed by Lucy Bailey and starring Douglas Hodge as Titus, Geraldine Alexander as Tamora, Sean Parks as Aaron and Laura Rees as Lavinia. Bailey focused on a realistic presentation throughout the production. For example, after her mutilation, Lavinia is covered from head to toe in blood, with her stumps crudely bandaged, and raw flesh visible beneath. So graphic was Bailey's use of realism that at several productions, audience members fainted upon Lavinia's appearance. Hitomi Minaka as Lavinia in Yukio Ninagawa's 2006 production, Titus Andronicus, at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. Note the use of red ribbons as a stylized substitute for blood. The second 2006 production opened at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre on the 9th of June as part of the Complete Works Festival, under the title Titus Andronicus. Directed by Yukio Ninagawa, it starred Kotaro Yoshida as Titus, Rei Asami as Tamora, Shunoguri as Aaron and Hitomi Minaka as Lavinia. Performed in Japanese. The original English text was projected as subtitles onto the back of the stage. In stark contrast to Bailey's production, theatricality was emphasized. The play begins with the company still rehearsing and getting into costume and the stage hands still putting the sets together. The production followed the 1955 Brooke production in its depiction of violence. Actress Hitomi Minaka appeared after the rape scene with stylized red ribbons coming from her mouth and arms, substituting for blood. Throughout the play, at the back of the stage, a huge marble wolf can be seen from which feed Romulus and Remus, with the implication being that Rome is a society based on animalistic origins. The play ends with young Lucius holding Aaron's baby out to the audience and crying out the horror. Quote. Several reviews of the time made much of the manner in which each production approached the appearance of Lavinia after the rape. At Shakespeare's Globe, the groundlings are fainting at the mutilations in Lucy Bailey's coarse but convincing production. To Stratford-upon-Avon, Yukio Ninagawa brings a Japanese staging so stylized that it keeps turning the horror into visual poetry. Quote. In 2007, Gail Edwards directed a production for the Shakespeare Theatre Company at the Harmon Center for the Arts, starring Sam Sotsuvas as Titus, Valerie Leonard as Tamora, Colleen Delaney as Lavinia and Peter Macon as Aaron. In 2011, Michael Saxton directed a modern military dress production at the Public Theatre on a minimalistic set made of plywood boards. The production had a low budget and much of it was spent on huge volumes of blood that literally drenched the actors in the final scene. As Sexton said, he was determined to outdo his contemporaries in terms of the amount of onstage blood in the play. The production starred J.O. Sanders, who was nominated for a Lucille Lortel as Titus, Stephanie Roth-Haberl as Tamora, Ron Cephas-Jones as Aaron and Jennifer Akeda as Lavinia. In 2013, Michael Fentiman directed the play for the Royal Shakespeare Company, with Stephen Boxer as Titus, Katie Stevens as Tamora, Kevin Harvey as Aaron and Rose Reynolds as Lavinia, emphasizing the gore and violence. The production carried a trailer with warnings of graphic imagery and scenes of butchery. Quote, it played at the Swan until October 2013. Outside Britain and the United States, other significant productions include Kwai Ping Xu's 1986 production in China, which drew political parallels to Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution and the Red Guards. Peter Stein's 1989 production in Italy, which evoked images of 20th-century fascism. Daniel Magaich's 1989 production in Paris, which set the entire play in a crumbling library, acting as a symbol for Roman civilization. Nenny Delmester's 1992 production in Zagreb, which acted as a metaphor for the struggles of the Croatian people, and Sylvie Percarit's 1992 Romanian production, which explicitly avoided using the play as a metaphor for the fall of Nicolae Ceausescu. This production is one of the most successful plays ever staged in Romania, and it was revived every year up to 1997. Adaptations. Plays. The first known adaptation of the play originated in the later years of the 16th century. In 1620, a German publication entitled English Komödien und Tragödien contained a play called Eine sehr kleinliche Tragödie von Tito Andronicus und der Hoffärtigen Kaiserin deren in Dankwürdige Aktionen zu finden, a most lamentable tragedy of Titus Andronicus and the haughty Empress, wherein are found memorable events. Transcribed by Frederick Manius. The play was a version of Titus performed by Robert Brown and John Green's group of traveling players. The overriding plot of Tito Andronicus is identical to Titus, but all the character names are different, with the exception of Titus himself. Written in prose, the play does not feature the fly-killing scene. Bassianus does not oppose Saturninus for the throne. Alarbus is absent. Quintus and Mucius are only seen after their death. Many of the classical and mythological allusions have been removed. Stage directions are much more elaborate. For example, in the banquet scene, Titus is described as wearing blood-soaked rags and carrying a butcher knife dripping with blood. Another European adaptation came in 1637, when Dutch dramatist Jan Vos wrote a version of the play entitled Aaron and Titus, which was published in 1641, and republished in 1642, 1644, 1648 and 1649. Illustrating its popularity, the play may have been based on a 1621 work, now lost, by Adrian van den Berg, which may itself have been a composite of the English Titus and the German Titus Andronicus. Vos' play focuses on Aaron, who, in the final scene, is burned alive on stage, beginning a tradition amongst adaptations of foregrounding the Moor and ending the play with his death. Miss P. Hopkins as Lavinia in Ravenscroft's The Rape of Lavinia, from John Bell's edition of Shakespeare. The earliest English-language adaptation was in 1678 at Drury Lane, by Edward Ravenscroft, Titus Andronicus, or The Rape of Lavinia, a tragedy, altered from Mr. Shakespeare's works, probably with Thomas Betterton as Titus and Samuel Sanford as Aaron. Ravenscroft made drastic alterations to the play. He removed all of 2. Preparing for the hunt. 3. The fly-killing scene. 4. Firing the arrows and sending the clown to Saturninus. And 4. The execution of the clown. Much of the violence was toned down. For example, both the murder of Chiron and Demetrius and Titus' amputation take place off-stage. A significant change in the first scene, and one with major implications for the rest of the play, is that, prior to the sacrifice of Alarbus, it is revealed that several years previously, Tamora had one of Titus' sons in captivity and refused to show him clemency despite Titus' pleas. Aaron has a much larger role in Ravenscroft than in Shakespeare, especially in Act 1, where lines originally assigned to Demetrius and Tamora are given to him. Tamora doesn't give birth during the action, but earlier, with the baby secretly kept by a nurse. To maintain the secret, Aaron kills the nurse, and it is the nurse's husband, not Lucius, who captures Aaron as he leaves Rome with the child. Additionally, Lucius's army is not composed of Goths, but of Roman centurions loyal to the Andronici. The last act is also considerably longer. Tamora and Saturninus both have lengthy speeches after their fatal stabbings. Tamora asks for her child to be brought to her, but she stabs it immediately upon receiving it. Aaron laments that Tamora has now outdone him in evil. She has outdone me in my own art, outdone me in murder. Killed her own child. Give it me. I leap it. Quote, he is burned alive as the climax of the play. In January and February 1839, an adaptation written and directed by and also starring Nathaniel Bannister was performed for 4 nights at the Walnut Street Theater in Philadelphia. The playbill had a note reading, "The Manager." In announcing this play, adapted by N.H. Bannister from the language of Shakespeare alone, assures the public that every expression calculated to offend the ear has been studiously avoided, and the play is presented for their decision with full confidence that it will merit approbation. Quote, in his History of the Philadelphia Stage, Volume 4, Charles Durang wrote, Bannister ably preserved the beauties of its poetry, the intensity of its incidents, and excluded the horrors with infinite skill, yet preserved all the interest of the drama. Nothing else is known about this production. The most successful adaptation of the play in Britain premiered in 1850, written by Ira Aldridge and C.A. Somerset. Aaron was rewritten to make him the hero of the piece, played by Aldridge. The rape and mutilation of Lavinia were removed. Tamora, Queen of Scythia, became chaste and honorable, with Aaron as her friend only, and Chiron and Demetrius act only out of love for their mother. Only Saturninus is a truly evil character. Towards the end of the play, Saturninus has Aaron chained to a tree, and his baby flung into the Tiber. Aaron frees himself however and leaps into the river after the child. At the end, Saturninus poisons Aaron, but as Aaron dies, Lavinia promises to look after his child for him, due to his saving her from rape earlier in the piece. An entire scene from Zarapha, The Slave King, a play written specifically for Aldridge in Dublin in 1847, was included in this adaptation. For example, the Era reviewer wrote, "The deflowerment of Lavinia, cutting out her tongue, chopping off her hands, and the numerous decapitations which occur in the original, are wholly omitted, and a play not only presentable but actually attractive is the result. Aaron is elevated into a noble and lofty character. Tamora, the Queen of Scythia, is a chaste though decidedly strong-minded female, and her connection with the Moor appears to be of legitimate description. Her sons Chiron and Demetrius are dutiful children, obeying the behests of their mother." Thus altered, Mr. Aldridge's conception of the part of Aaron is excellent. Gentle and impassioned by turns, now burning with jealousy as he doubts the honor of the queen, anon, fierce with rage, as he reflects upon the wrongs which have been done him. The murder of Alarbus and the abduction of his son, and then all tenderness and emotion in the gentler passages with his infant. The next adaptation was in 1951, when Kenneth Tynan and Peter Myers staged a 35-minute version entitled Andronicus as part of a grand guignol presentation at the Irving Theatre. Produced in the tradition of theatre of cruelty, the production edited together all of the violent scenes, emphasized the gore, and removed Aaron entirely. In a review in the Sunday Times on the 11th of November, Harold Hobson wrote the stage was full of practically the whole company waving gory stumps and eating cannibal pies. Quote, "In 1957, the Old Vic staged a heavily edited 90-minute performance as part of a double bill with an edited version of The Comedy of Errors, directed by Walter Hudd. Both plays were performed by the same company of actors, with Derek Godfrey as Titus, Barbara Shefford as Tamora, Margaret Whiting as Lavinia and Robert Helpman as Saturninus, performed in the manner of a traditional Elizabethan production. The play received mixed reviews. The Times, for example, felt that the juxtaposition of the blood tragedy and the frothy comedy was ill-conceived. In 1970, Swiss dramatist Friedrich Dürrenmatt adapted the play into a German-language comedy entitled Titus Andronicus, Commodie nach Shakespeare. Titus Andronicus, a comedy after Shakespeare. If the adaptation, he wrote, it represents an attempt to render Shakespeare's early chaotic work fit for the German stage without having the Shakespearean atrocities and grotesqueries passed over in silence. Working from a translation of the first folio text by Wolfgraf von Bottesen, Dürrenmatt altered much of the dialogue and changed elements of the plot. The fly-killing scene and the interrogation of Aaron were removed. Titus has Aaron cut off his hand, and after he realizes he has been tricked, Marcus brings Lavinia to him rather than the other way around as in the original play. Another major change is that after Aaron is presented with his love child, he flees Rome immediately, and successfully, and is never heard from again. Dürrenmatt also added a new scene, where Lucius arrives at the Goth camp and persuades their leader, Alaric, to help him. At the end of the play, after Lucius has stabbed Saturninus, but before he has given his final speech, Alaric betrays him, kills him, and orders his army to destroy Rome and kill everyone in it. In 1981, John Barton followed the 1957 Old Vic model and directed a heavily edited version of the play as a double bill with The Two Gentlemen of Verona for the RSC, starring Patrick Stewart as Titus. Sheila Hancock as Tamora, Hugh Quarshie as Aaron, and Leonie Mellinger as Lavinia. Theatricality and falseness were emphasized, and when actors were off stage, they could be seen at the sides of the stage watching the performance. The production received lukewarm reviews, and had an average box office. In 1984, German playwright Heiner Müller adapted the play into Anatomy Titus, Fall of Rome, Ein Shakespeare-Kommentar, Anatomy Titus, Fall of Rome, a Shakespearean commentary, interspersing the dialogue with a chorus-like commentary. The adaptation was heavily political and made reference to numerous 20th-century events, such as the rise of the Third Reich, Stalinism, the erection of the Berlin Wall and the attendant emigration and defection issues, and the 1973 Chilean coup d'etat. Müller removed the entire first act, replacing it with a narrated introduction, and completely rewrote the final act. He described the work as terrorist in nature, and foregrounded the violence. For example, Lavinia is brutally raped on stage and Aaron takes several hacks at Titus' hand before amputating it. First performed at the Schauspielhaus Bochum. It was directed by Manfred Karge and Matthias Langhoff, and is still regularly revived in Germany. In 1989, Jeanette Lambermont directed a heavily edited kabuki version of the play at the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, in a double bill with the Comedy of Errors, starring Nicholas Pennell as Titus, Goldie Semple as Tamora, Hubert Baron Kelly as Aaron, and Lucy Peacock as Lavinia. In 2005, German playwright Bodo Strauss adapted the play into Shandong, nach dem Titus Andronicus von Shakespeare. Rape, after Titus Andronicus by Shakespeare, also commonly known by its French name, vile, depraise Titus Andronicus de William Shakespeare. Set in both a contemporary and an ancient world predating the Roman Empire, the adaptation begins with a group of salesmen trying to sell real estate, gated communities which they proclaim as terra secura, where women and children are secure from theft, rape and kidnapping. Mythology is important in the adaptation. Venus is represented as governing nature, but as losing her power to the melancholic and uninterested Saturn, leading to a society rampant with Bedeutungslosigkeit, loss of meaning, insignificance, written in prose rather than blank verse. Changes to the text include the rape of Lavinia being Tamora's idea instead of Aaron's, the removal of Marcus. Titus does not kill his son. He does not have his hand amputated. Chiron is much more subservient to Demetrius. Aaron is more philosophical, trying to find meaning in his acts of evil rather than simply reveling in them. Titus does not die at the end, nor does Tamora, although the play ends with Titus ordering the deaths of Tamora and Aaron. In 2008, Müller's Anatomy Titus was translated into English by Julian Hammond and performed at the Cremorne Theatre in Brisbane, the Canberra Theatre, the Playhouse in the Sydney Opera House and the Malthouse Theatre, Melbourne by the Bell Shakespeare Company and the Queensland Theatre Company. Directed by Michael Gowand with an all-male cast. It starred John Bell as Titus, Peter Cook as Tamora, Timothy Walter as Aaron, and Thomas Campbell as Lavinia. Racism was a major theme in this production, with Aaron initially wearing a gorilla mask, and then poorly applied blackface, and his baby, played by a gollywog. In 2012, as part of the Globe to Globe Festival at Shakespeare's Globe, the play was performed under the title Titus Chapter 2.0, directed by Tang Shu Wing. It starred Andy Ng Shek as Titus, Ivy Peng Nanling as Tamora, Chu Pak Hong as Aaron, and Lai Yuk Ching as Lavinia. Performed entirely in Cantonese, from an original script by Cancer Chung. The play had originally been staged in Hong Kong in 2009. The production took a minimalist approach and featured very little blood, after Lavinia has her hands cut off. For example, she simply wears red gloves for the rest of the play. The production features a narrator throughout, who speaks both in first person and third person, sometimes directly to the audience, sometimes to other characters on the stage. The role of the narrator alternates throughout the play, but is always performed by a member of the main cast. The production received excellent reviews, both in its original Hong Kong incarnation, and when restaged at the Globe. In 2014, Noelle Fair and Lisa Legrand adapted the play into interpreting her martyred signs, the title of which is taken from Titus' claim to be able to understand the mute Lavinia. Focusing on the backstories of Tamora and Lavinia, the play is set in purgatory shortly after their deaths, where they find themselves in a waiting area with Aaron as their salvation or damnation is decided upon, as they try to come to terms with their unresolved conflict. Aaron serves as a master of ceremonies, initiating a dialogue between them, leading to a series of flashbacks to their lives prior to the beginning of the play. Musicals. Titus Andronicus, the musical, written by Brian Colonna, Eric Edberg, Hannah Duggan, Aaron Rollman, Evan Weissman, Matt Petraglia, and Samantha Schmitz, was staged by the Buntport Theater Company in Denver, Colorado 4 times between 2002 and 2007. Staged as a band of traveling thespian players who are attempting to put on a serious production of Titus, and starring Brian Colonna as Titus, Aaron Rollman as Tamora, and Marcus, Hannah Duggan as both Aaron and Lavinia. When playing Aaron, she wore a fake mustache. Eric Edberg as Lucius and Saturninus, and Evan Weissman as someone who will probably die. He is killed over 30 times during the play. The piece was very much a farce, and included such moments as Lavinia singing an aria to the tune of Oops, I Did It Again, by Britney Spears, after her tongue has been cut out. Saturninus and Lucius engaged in a sword fight, but both being played by the same actor. Chiron and Demetrius played by a gas can and a car radio respectively, the love child being born with a black mustache. A number of critics felt that the play improved on Shakespeare's original, and several wondered what Harold Bloom would have made of it. Tragedy, a musical comedy, written by Michael Johnson and Mary Davenport, was performed at the 2007 New York International Fringe Festival in the Lucille Lortel Theater. Directed by Johnson, the piece starred Francis Van Wettering as Titus, Alexandre Servaz as Tamora, Roger Casey as Aaron, aka the evil black guy, and Lauren Hyatt as Lavinia. Staged as a farce, the production included moments such as Lavinia singing a song entitled "At Least I Can Still Sing" after having her hands cut off. But as she reaches the finale, Chiron and Demetrius return and cut out her tongue. Lucius is portrayed as a homosexual in love with Saturninus, and everyone knows except Titus. Titus kills Lucius not because he defies him, but because he discovers that Lucius wants to be a tap dancer instead of a soldier. Bassianus is a transvestite, Saturninus is addicted to prescription medication, and Tamora is a nymphomaniac. Film. In 1969, Robert Hartford Davis planned to make a feature film starring Christopher Lee as Titus and Leslie Ann Down as Lavinia, but the project never materialized. The 1973 horror comedy film Theater of Blood, directed by Douglas Hickox, featured a very loose adaptation of the play. Vincent Price stars in the film as Edward Lionheart, who regards himself as the finest Shakespearean actor of all time, when he fails to be awarded the prestigious Critics' Circle Award for Best Actor. He sets out exacting bloody revenge on the critics who gave him poor reviews, with each act inspired by a death in a Shakespeare play. One such act of revenge involves the critic Meredith Meridew, played by Robert Morley. Lionheart abducts Meridew's prized poodles, and bakes them in a pie, which he then feeds to Meridew, before revealing all and force-feeding the critic until he chokes to death. A 1997 straight-to-video adaptation, which cuts back on the violence, Titled Titus Andronicus, the movie was directed by Lorne Ritchie and starred Ross Dipple as Titus, Aldrich Allen as Aaron, and Maureen Moran as Lavinia. In 1999, Julie Taymor directed an adaptation entitled Titus, starring Anthony Hopkins as Titus, Jessica Lange as Tamora, Harry Lennox as Aaron, reprising his role from Taymor's 1994 theatrical production, and Laura Fraser as Lavinia. As with Taymor's stage production, the film begins with a young boy playing with toy soldiers and being whisked away to ancient Rome, where he assumes the character of young Lucius. A major component of the film is the mixing of the old and modern. Chiron and Demetrius dress like modern rock stars, but the Andronici dress like Roman soldiers. Some characters use chariots, some used cars and motorcycles. Crossbows and swords are used alongside rifles and pistols. Tanks are seen driven by soldiers in ancient Roman garb. Bottled beer is seen alongside ancient bottles of wine. Microphones are used to address characters in ancient clothing. According to Taymor, this anachronistic structure was created to emphasize the timelessness of the violence in the film, to suggest that violence is universal to all humanity, at all times. Costume, paraphernalia, horses or chariots or cars. These represent the essence of a character, as opposed to placing it in a specific time. This is a film that takes place from the year 1 to the year 2000. Quote, William Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, directed by Richard Griffin and starring Nigel Gore as Titus, Zoe Pearson as Tamora, Kevin Butler as Aaron and Molly Lloyd as Lavinia, was released direct-to-video in 2000. Shot on DVN and around Providence, Rhode Island with a budget of $12,000. The film is set in a modern business milieu. Saturninus is a corporate head who has inherited a company from his father, and the Goths feature as contemporary Goths. Television. In 1970, Finnish TV channel YLE-TV1 screened an adaptation of the play written and directed by Juga Sipilä, starring Leo Lastumaki as Titus, Iris Lelia-Lasala as Tamora, Eugene Hallman as Aaron and Maja Leno as Lavinia. In 1985, the BBC produced a version of the play for their BBC television Shakespeare series, directed by Jane Howell. The play was the 37th and final episode of the series and starred Trevor Peacock as Titus, Eileen Atkins as Tamora, Hugh Quarshie as Aaron and Anna Calder-Marshall as Lavinia. Because Titus was broadcast several months after the rest of the 7th season, it was rumored that the BBC were worried about the violence in the play and that disagreements had arisen about censorship. This was inaccurate, however, with the delay caused by a BBC strike in 1984. The episode had been booked into the studio in February and March 1984, but the strike meant it couldn't shoot. When the strike ended, the studio couldn't be used as it was being used by another production. And then, when the studio became available, the RSC was using Trevor Peacock, and filming didn't take place until February 1985. A year later than planned. Young Lucius stares at the body of Aaron's baby in Jane Howell's adaptation for the BBC television Shakespeare. In the background, his father is being inaugurated as the new emperor. For the most part, the adaptation followed Q1 exactly, and F1 for 3:2, with some minor alterations. For example, a few lines were cut from various scenes, such as Lavinia's "I" for these slips have made him noted long, thus removing the continuity error regarding the duration of the Goths' residence in Rome. Other examples include Titus, wherefore dost thou urge the name of hands? To bid Aeneas tell the tale twice, or how Troy was burnt and he made miserable. Quote, Marquis, what? The lustful sons of Tamora, performers of this heinous, bloody deed. And Titus and Marcus' brief conversation about Turris and Iris. The adaptation also includes some lines from Q1 which were removed in subsequent editions. At 1:35 Titus, bearing his valiant sons in coffins from the field, continues with, and at this day, to the monument of that Andronicus, done sacrifice of expiation, and slain the noblest prisoner of the goes. These lines are usually omitted because they create a continuity problem regarding the sacrifice of Alarbus, which hasn't happened yet in the text. However, Howell got around this problem by beginning the play at 1:64, the entrance of Titus. Then, at 1:168, after the sacrifice of Alarbus, lines 1:1-1:63, the introductions of Bassianus and Saturninus take place. Thus Titus' reference to Alarbus' sacrifice makes chronological sense. Another notable stylistic technique used in the adaptation is multiple addresses direct to camera. For example, Saturninus, "How well the Tribune speaks to calm my thoughts." Timoris vow to slaughter the Andronici at 1:455, thus absolving Saturninus from any involvement. Aaron's soliloquy in 2:1, Aaron's I, and as good as Saturninus may. Aaron's soliloquy in 2:3, Timoris, "Now will I hence to seek my lovely more, and let my spleenful sons this trulled deflower." Aaron's two asides in 3:1, 187, 190 and 201. 202. Lucius's, "Now will I to the Goths and raise a power, to be revenged on Rome and Saturnine." Marquis, "Oh, heavens! Can you hear a good man groan?" speech. Young Lucius's asides in 4:2, 6 and 8, 9. Aaron's, "Now to the Goths, as swift as swallow flies, there to dispose this treasure in mine arms, and secretly to greet the Empress' friends." And Timoris, "Now will I to that old Andronicus, and temper him with all the art I have, to pluck proud Lucius from the warlike Goths." The most significant difference from the original play concerned the character of young Lucius, who is a much more important figure in the adaptation. He is present throughout Act 1, and retrieves the murder weapon after the death of Lucius. It is his knife which Titus uses to kill the fly. He aids in the capture of Chiron and Demetrius. He is present throughout the final scene, much as Julie Taymor would do in her 1999 filmic adaptation. Howell set young Lucius as the center of the production to prompt the question, "What are we doing to the children?" Quote, in 2001, the animated sitcom South Park based an episode on the play. In Scott Tenorman Must Die, Eric Cartman is swindled by Scott Tenorman. Cartman tries various methods to get his money back, but Scott remains always one step ahead. He then decides to exact revenge on Scott. After numerous failed attempts, he hatches a plan which culminates in him having Scott's parents killed, the bodies of whom he then cooks in chili, which he feeds to Scott. He then gleefully reveals his deception as Scott finds his mother's finger in the chili. Radio. The play has very rarely been staged for radio. In 1923, extracts were broadcast on BBC Radio, performed by the Cardiff Station Repertory Company as the second episode of a series of programs showcasing Shakespeare's plays, entitled Shakespeare Night. In 1953, BBC Third program aired a 130-minute version of the play, adapted for radio by J.C. Truden and starring Balliol Holloway as Titus, Sonia Dresdel as Tamora, George Hayes as Aaron and Jeanette Tregarthen as Lavinia. In 1973, BBC Radio 3 aired an adaptation directed by Martin Jenkins, starring Michael Aldridge as Titus, Barbara Shefford as Tamora, Julian Glover as Aaron and Frances Jeter as Lavinia. In 1986, Austrian radio channel Österreich 1 staged an adaptation by Kurt Klinger, starring Romuald Pekny as Titus, Marion Degler as Tamora, Wolfgang Bach as Aaron and Elizabeth Augustine as Lavinia. Editions of Titus Andronicus. Adams, Joseph Quincy, ed. Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus. The First Quarto. 1594. New York. C. Scribner's Sons. 1936. Greenblatt, Stephen. Cohen, Walter. Howard, Jeannie. And Mouse. Catherine Eisman. eds. The Norton Shakespeare. Based on the Oxford Shakespeare. London. Norton. 1997. Wells, Stanley, Taylor, Gary, Jowett, John and Montgomery, William, eds. The Oxford Shakespeare. The Complete Works. Chiron, and Demetrius, and Aaron the Moor, her secret lover. Despite Timora's desperate pleas, Titus sacrifices her eldest son, Alarbus, to avenge the deaths of his own sons during the war. Distraught, Timora and her two surviving sons vow to obtain revenge on Titus and his family. Meanwhile, Titus refuses the offer of the throne, arguing that he is not fit to rule and instead supporting the claim of Saturninus, who then is duly elected. Saturninus tells Titus that for his first act as emperor, he will marry Titus's daughter Lavinia. Titus agrees, although Lavinia is already betrothed to Saturninus's brother, Bassianus, who refuses to give her up. Titus's sons tell Titus that Bassianus is in the right under Roman law, but Titus refuses to listen, accusing them all of treason. A scuffle breaks out, during which Titus kills his own son, Mucius. Saturninus then denounces the Andronici family for their effrontery and shocks Titus by marrying Timora, putting into motion her plan for revenge. Timora advises Saturninus to pardon Bassianus and the Andronici family, which he reluctantly does. During a royal hunt the following day, Aaron persuades Demetrius and Chiron to kill Bassianus, so they may rape Lavinia. They do so, throwing Bassianus's body into a pit and dragging Lavinia deep into the forest before violently raping her. To keep her from revealing what has happened, they cut out her tongue and cut off her hands. Meanwhile, Aaron writes a forged letter, which frames Titus's sons Martius and Quintus for the murder of Bassianus. Horrified at the death of his brother, Saturninus arrests Martius and Quintus, and sentences them to death. Some time later, Marcus discovers the mutilated Lavinia and takes her to her father, who is still shocked at the accusations leveled at his sons. And upon seeing Lavinia, he is overcome with grief. Aaron then visits Titus and falsely tells him that Saturninus will spare Martius and Quintus if either Titus, Marcus or Titus's remaining son, Lucius, cuts off one of their hands and sends it to him. Titus has Aaron cut off his Titus' left hand and sends it to the emperor, but, in return, a messenger brings Titus Martius and Quintus's severed heads, along with Titus's own severed hand. Desperate for revenge, Titus orders Lucius to flee Rome and raise an army among their former enemy, the Goths. Later, Lavinia writes the names of her attackers in the dirt, using a stick held with her mouth and between her mutilated arms. Meanwhile, Timora secretly gives birth to a mixed-race child, fathered by Aaron. Aaron kills the nurse to keep the child's race a secret and flees with the baby to save it from Saturninus' inevitable wrath. Thereafter, Lucius, marching on Rome with an army, captures Aaron and threatens to hang the infant. In order to save the baby, Aaron reveals the entire revenge plot to Lucius. Illustration of the death of Chiron and Demetrius from Act 5, Scene 2, from the works of Mr. William Shakespeare, edited by Nicholas Rowe. Back in Rome, Titus's behavior suggests he may have gone insane. Convinced of his madness, Timora, Chiron, and Demetrius approach him, dressed as the spirits of revenge, murder, and rape. Timora, as revenge, tells Titus that she will grant him revenge on all of his enemies if he can convince Lucius to postpone the imminent attack on Rome. Titus agrees and sends Marcus to invite Lucius to a reconciliatory feast. Revenge then offers to invite the emperor and Timora as well, and is about to leave when Titus insists that rape and murder, Chiron and Demetrius, respectively, stay with him. When Timora is gone, Titus cuts their throats and drains their blood into a basin held by Lavinia. Titus morbidly tells Lavinia that he plans to play the cook, grind the bones of Demetrius and Chiron into powder, and bake their heads. The next day, during the feast at his house, Titus asks Saturninus if a father should kill his daughter when she has been raped. When Saturninus answers that he should, Titus kills Lavinia and tells Saturninus of the rape. When the emperor calls for Chiron and Demetrius, Titus reveals that they have been baked in the pie Timora has just been eating. Titus then kills Timora and is immediately killed by Saturninus, who is subsequently killed by Lucius to avenge his father's death. Lucius is then proclaimed emperor. He orders that Saturninus be given a state burial, that Timora's body be thrown to the wild beasts outside the city, and that Aaron be buried chest deep and left to die of thirst and starvation. Aaron, however, is unrepentant to the end, regretting only that he had not done more evil in his life. Date and text. Date. The earliest known record of Titus Andronicus is found in Philip Henslow's diary on the 24th of January 1594, where Henslow recorded a performance by Sussex's men of Titus and Andronicus, probably at the Rose. Henslow marked the play as "Nay," which most critics take to mean "new." There were subsequent performances on the 29th of January and the 6th of February. Also on the 6th of Titus Andronicus is a tragedy by William Shakespeare, believed to have been written between 1588 and 1593, probably in collaboration with George Peele. It is thought to be Shakespeare's first tragedy, and is often seen as his attempt to emulate the violent and bloody revenge plays of his contemporaries, which were extremely popular with audiences throughout the 16th century. The play is set during the latter days of the Roman Empire and tells the fictional story of Titus, a general in the Roman army, who is engaged in a cycle of revenge with Timora, Queen of the Goths. It is Shakespeare's bloodiest and most violent work, and traditionally was one of his least respected plays. Although it was extremely popular in its day, by the later 17th century it had fallen out of favor. In the Victorian era, it was disapproved of, primarily because of what was considered to be a distasteful use of graphic violence. But from around the middle of the 20th century its reputation began to improve. Characters. Synopsis. Gravelot illustration of Aaron cutting off Titus's hand in Act 3. Scene 1. Engraved by Gerard van der Gucht. The play begins shortly after the death of the Roman emperor, with his two sons, Saturninus and Bassianus, squabbling over who will succeed him. Their conflict seems set to boil over into violence until a tribune, Marcus Andronicus, announces that the people's choice for the new emperor is Marcus's brother, Titus, who will shortly return to Rome from a victorious 10-year campaign against the Goths. Titus subsequently arrives to much fanfare, bearing with him as prisoners the Queen of the Goths, Timora, her three sons, Alarbus. February. The printer John Danter entered into the Stationer's Register, a book entitled A Noble Roman History of Titus Andronicus. Later, in 1594, Danter published the play in quarto under the title The Most Lamentable Roman Tragedy of Titus Andronicus, referred to by scholars as Q1, for the booksellers Edward White and Thomas Millington, making it the first of Shakespeare's plays to be printed. This evidence establishes that the latest possible date of composition is late 1593. There is evidence, however, that the play may have been written some years earlier than this. Perhaps the most famous such evidence relates to a comment made in 1614 by Ben Jonson in Bartholomew Fair. In the preface, Jonson wrote, "He that will swear Geronimo or Andronicus are the best plays, yet shall pass unaccepted at here, as a man whose judgment shows it is constant, and hath stood still these 25 or 30 years." The success and popularity of Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, to which Jonson alludes, is attested by many contemporary documents. So by placing Titus alongside it, Jonson is saying that Titus too must have been extremely popular in its day. But by 1614, both plays had come to be seen as old-fashioned, if Jonson is taken literally. for the play to have been between 25 and 30 years old in 1614. It must have been written between 1584 and 1589, a theory which not all scholars reject out of hand. For example, in his 1953 edition of the play for the Art and Shakespeare Second Series, J.C. Maxwell argues for a date of late 1589. However, the majority of scholars